I'm interested to hear Dan's take on that.
Well, let's get Dan. We seem to have Dan and not a dial tone this time. So, Dan, good morning. Thanks for being with us. We appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, guys. How are you?
Well, we're good. It's a pretty busy, crazy, huge day in the NFL, and we've been talking about some of your reporting on the Seahawks. You listed 3 Ravens you think that they could potentially bring in order of likelihood. How deep into the Ravens team and free agency do you think they'll go?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think maybe you see a guy like this coordinator to head coach job. Sometimes they'll want to bring a player or two to sort of help teach their system to the guys who don't know it, right? Like somebody who speaks Mike McDonald can help the other guys who aren't familiar with him. So I think, a lot of people speculate that Patrick Queen, the linebacker, could be somebody like that. Now, Queen is a guy who really didn't take off as a player until the Ravens got Roquan Smith to pair with him. So you wonder, would he be able to take on that, leader of the defense role in a new place? It's possible. I think, obviously Mike McDonald would know better than I would. But that is a player that I think a lot of people think is going to get priced out of Baltimore and could end up following his coordinator to Seattle. And I know Brady just mentioned Geno Stone, who had a big year, and then Clowney. He's just a wild card. I mean, he was only in Baltimore. He bounces around so much and does one-year deals, and sometimes very late in the off season. It's tough to forecast that, but he did play well in that system and could have some interest in staying in it.
Dan, you had to be here for Jadeveon Clowney watch a couple years ago. It was like nothing I've ever seen. Yeah. So he played in Seattle in 2019, and then the fan base was obsessed with the idea of re-signing Jadeveon Clowney the following offseason. So I'm curious. I know he was available at a pretty discounted rate for Baltimore last year. I'm curious what you think it would cost to sign him now, coming off a 9.5 sack season. And then a similar question on Queen. You mentioned Roquan Smith, who I believe is at the top of the inside linebacker market at north of $20 million per season. What kind of deal do you think it would take to add Patrick Queen as well?
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Now, you talk about Seattle, usually a very careful team in free agency that kind of looks for deals. And so if you're talking about playing at the top end of the linebacker market, for example, a position that's not viewed as a premium position, and you're going to stretch financially for that, that would probably reflect your new defensive-minded head coach's desire for a player, if that were to happen. So, we'll see if they're willing to go that high, if in fact he's going to get that kind of deal. Clowney, at his age, it's funny, you say 9.5 sacks. He's still never had 10 in a season.
Right.
I think it's one of the most amazing stats. Like, he was the number 1 pick, been a really good player his whole career, never had a double-digit sack season. But I think that the edge rusher market is going to be very, very fluid at a number of different levels. You have teams like the Eagles and the Chargers that are out there sort of trying to trade the guys they already have. You have, players like Daniil Hunter and Chase Young, who are appealing for different reasons that could stick with their current teams or could hit the market yet. So I think there's a lot on the edge rusher market. There's always teams looking for it. So where does that settle? And where does Jadeveon Clowney, at his age, as a guy who's had a propensity for bouncing from team to team and doing one-year deals, seems to enjoy that, seems to be enjoying this part of his career in that way. Does he wait? Or does he, is he a guy? We're going to find out, right, like what Mike McDonald thought of these guys because by how strongly the Seahawks pursue them.
Well, it's funny, talking to Dan Graziano, I mean, it's not a great draft for edge guys, right? I mean, there's a couple, but that's not considered to be the strength of this draft. You mentioned that there are some teams looking to part ways with the guys they already have. Why is that? Is the position losing value in some way, or is this just there have been enough guys that have come around recently that, it's time to move on from some of the older ones?
I think in Philadelphia, it's a scheme issue. They're bringing in Vic Fangio as a new defensive coordinator, and he might have different guys in mind. And if they think they can get, let's just hypothetically say, a guy like a Bryce Huff from the Jets or Jonathan Grenard from the Texans, then they're going to have to clear a spot, right? Because that'll be a big money signing, and they would want to move on from one of their guys to open up a spot for him. If Fangio sees one of those other guys as a better fit for what he wants to do. And then with the Chargers, it's finances. Chargers have 4 players: Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, Keenan Allen and Mike Williams all have cap hits over $32 million for this year. They're projected way over. So they're going to have to unload some of these guys, and I think they're hoping that Bosa and Mack draw some trade interest, and maybe they can unload them that way.
Dan, what are you hearing on Leonard Williams? Obviously, the Seahawks have a ton of incentive to try to get something done with him after giving up the second-round pick to get him from the Giants in October. It's not going to be cheap, especially with Draymond Jones playing in Seattle on a $17.5 million contract. I view that as the floor for Leonard Williams, but what do you think it's going to cost? What do you think the ceiling could be for Leonard Williams re-signing there?
Yeah, I think the defensive tackle market, I think, is going to be good, like for the players, and especially at the top. And you see the deal that Chris Jones just got from the Chiefs, extremely strong for the player. The deal that Justin Madubuike signed with the Ravens is a more realistic comp for the top end of the free agent defensive tackle market, but also extremely strong for the player. I think you're going to see Christian Wilkins get a nice big deal from someone, maybe as early as this afternoon. He's a guy that I think Houston has its eye on and a couple other teams. So that defensive tackle market is going to be, I think it's going to be pricey. I think that's a position that people have identified as important and that they want to spend on, maybe to an extent they didn't used to. But you're right. Like, how does Seattle want to spend big on two guys at the same position? I think that's a good question. And then do they have work to do at other spots, like on the edge? And we know that gets pricey too. So I think that would be my question: is Leonard Williams going to be able to find if he wants to max out, is he better off elsewhere, or can Seattle craft something that keeps him, even if they don't necessarily have the flexibility to play at the top end of that market?
I'm going to make a large part of our audience groan out loud right now because they're going to make fun of me for being the only person in the world continuing to talk about this as a subject. But I'll ask you about it anyway. If the Seahawks were interested in trading DK Metcalf, what would the market be in terms of a return that they could get back for him?
So interesting, because 2 years ago this happened in a number of places, right? 2 years ago we saw Tyreek Hill and A.J. Brown and Devontae Adams all get traded and sign new contracts with the team they were going to. Now, DK doesn't need a contract, right? Like he's still
he's signed up.
Paid. Like, right. So you would think you would be able to get more for him than those teams got for those players 2 years ago, because it doesn't come with the necessity of, laying out a huge signing bonus, et cetera, et cetera. So, that's a lot. Like, A.J. Brown, they got a first round. I would think that would be, has to be where it would start if you were going to move a guy like that. The wide receiver market, there's the trade market, right? Like we just saw this morning, T. Higgins requesting a trade out of Cincinnati. Will others follow suit? Michael Pittman's in Indianapolis on a franchise tag. Is he going to be happy about that? Brandon Ayuk in San Francisco on the fifth-year option. Is he going to be happy if they don't give him an extension? So we could see a repeat of what we saw in the offseason 2 years ago. But then the other thing with receiver guys is that nobody signed last year, right? So Justin Jefferson and guys like that, or CeeDee Lamb, still looking for the big extension that could also reset the top of the market financially. So when you talk about prices for high-end wide receivers, I think they're going to be high. I haven't heard anything about the Seahawks trading DK Metcalf or wanting to, but if they did, I imagine they could get a first-round pick and maybe more.
Well, they haven't had a conversation, at least publicly, that I know of. I've been the one having the conversation, and I don't work for them.
You're just trying to mess with people.
Well, I just look at it, Dan, and I say, all right, if you're a team and you got a new coach and you're trying to revamp your system, you might want to get a quarterback in this draft, and if you do, you might need to move up to get him. You need help at tackle. You need help at defensive line. You've imbalanced your team with a bunch of wide receivers and cornerbacks and safeties and stuff over the last few years. If you want to try to change that up and kind of build from the inside out, he's the one guy on your team who brings back value. It's not that I don't like DK. I love him. Fantastic player.
No, I understand.
But how do you remake your team?
Right, and that's right. And if they're keeping Lockett, right, and they drafted a first-round receiver last year, and they got some production out of a late-round receiver they drafted last year, so you're deep there. But the counter is, like, there's no DK replacement. Like, he's a different player, right? It's not just like, we drafted receivers so we can move on from DK. He brings something more to the table than that, and I would think kind of unique value.
Dan, let's switch gears here a little bit to the draft. A lot of people here obviously have a lot of interest in Michael Penix and where he might wind up, not only what team, but what part of the draft. I'm curious what your takeaway was from his performance, his showing at the Combine.
So the biggest thing with Penix at the Combine, as I understand it, was the medical evaluations because he's got such an injury history. So teams really wanted to get a look at the medicals, and my understanding is they came back pleased that things check out in terms of his health, and they assess, risk of future injury, all that kind of stuff. So that was massive for Penix, and my understanding also is talking to people who evaluate these kinds of things, that he threw the ball well. So, we'll see. Like, he could be a guy. You have your top three that everybody thinks are going 1, 2, 3, right? Caleb Williams and Drake May and Jaden Daniels. I don't know if that's the exact order, but I think that the thought is they'll be the first three. And then it sounds like teams really like J.J. McCarthy, and he has a chance to be the fourth guy taken. So that leaves Penix and Bo Nix probably in that next group, maybe Spencer Rattler. I guess it depends. But where do they get taken? There's all these teams, in this sort of early teens range, right? Like, even earlier than that. If the Falcons don't get Kirk Cousins, they're picking 8. The Vikings lose Kirk Cousins, they're right there in that early teens range. I think 11, Raiders at 12, Broncos 13. I may have the Vikings and Broncos reversed. But that group is probably the group that's looking for quarterback in the middle of the first round. And if Penix is to be a first rounder, I would imagine he probably goes off the board around there. Now, if those teams look elsewhere, could he tumble? Could he be an early second rounder? Could he be somebody teams try to move into the back end of the first round to get? I think all that's on the table, but long way to go in that evaluation process, pro days, et cetera. But I think the Combine was a positive for Penix.
Last question here, Dan, and real quick. If you were the Seahawks and you have Geno Smith signed up long-term, or at least for the next couple of years at somewhat reasonable money.
Hey, do they?
Yeah, I mean, they have him if they want him.
Yeah.
Are you drafting a quarterback this year? Are you looking this season to find your long-term option at quarterback?
I think if it lines up for you, yeah. If you have a guy you like and you're in range of being able to get him, I think you have to, because that Geno contract, as you guys know, is built, with escapability in it, and that's it's not because they don't like Geno, it's because of his age and the thought that can you count on him as your long-term solution. So I think if they have a guy they love, yeah, I think if you're Seattle, the beauty of the Geno deal and the way he's played the last couple of years is that you don't have to force it.
Good stuff. We appreciate it, Dan. Huge day today. We'll be following along and watching your stuff and waiting for you and Brady to continue to combine on big stories, which is always fun for us. So thanks, man.
Thanks, Dan.
We appreciate it.
To me, Brady, you got my number. Thanks.
Yes, sir.
There you go. There's Dan Graziano.